So I guess we're going to start off with substantial additional budget cuts. And introducing the topic for us in favor of said additional substantial budget cuts is Melodie Wilterdink, the Associate Director of the Alaska Policy Forum. Thank you, Melodie.
Hi, so thank you for having me here, Alaska Common Ground. I am delighted to see that there are so many people really engaged on this topic, and I could not be happier to be presenting something that is, so popular. So let's get into this. I am debating in favor, like you said, of substantial additional budget cuts. So we all know there are two ways to close a budget gap. It is increasing revenue or reducing spending. I'm not here to argue against the careful consideration of revenue increasing options, but I am here to say that our budget gap is so large, substantial spending reductions are still going to be necessary again this year. We're dealing with a grim reality in Alaska, as you've seen from the charts we just saw, but we still have time to make a course correction. As we all know, Alaska's government has run almost entirely on oil revenue for many years. Back in 2008, the petroleum-derived revenues soared to over $12 billion, and they stayed above $5 billion through 2014, so they were very flush years. But now, with production and prices low, we're seeing these huge budget deficits that have dwindled our reserve down to, as you saw on the chart, $2.1 billion left. Back in 2014, we had $19 billion between our two budget reserve funds. So on top of that, the governor's proposed budget would move another $1.5 billion into our spending for fiscal year 2021, leaving just $500 million in those funds for future years. Now, additionally, our unrestricted general fund revenues are estimated to be about $2 billion for the upcoming fiscal year, but the proposed unrestricted fund spending is $4.5 billion. Obviously, these numbers are not adding up. On top of that, state analysts expect that our per barrel crude oil prices from the North Slope are going to take until 2029 to get back to the already low 2019 levels that we saw last year. So what are we dealing with here? Is this a revenue slump, a rainy day, or a new normal for the state of Alaska? And that's really what we have to consider. So without spending reductions, we risk pushing this problem into next year when we'll only have $500 million left in savings and as oil revenues continue to decline. And the situation could be even worse than we expect because demand for oil has plummeted in China due to the coronavirus. So now's the time to act. Policymakers have this opportunity. We see the problem, we know it's coming, to go and discuss with their communities what can be cut, what government funding can be cut, and what is absolutely essential before the crisis really hits and we end up having to take haircuts on even our most basic programs. That's really what we're looking at, even with the 50-50 POMV draw that you saw, and a stable budget with including inflation means a lower budget every year. We're looking at big deficits. But it's not all bad news. There should be room for reducing spending still. Back in 2016, fiscal year 2016, when Alaska's population was at its peak, the operating budget was $8.5 billion, and that's actually lower than the proposed operating budget this year of $8.9 billion. We're spending more money now, but on fewer people. And in fact, it's $14,475 per person, which is higher than any other state and over twice the national average. There's got to be some room here. So despite that, we know, everybody who was in Alaska last year, that the budget cuts were difficult and they were painful. But the idea that tax increases would be less painful is misguided. Whether it's instituting broad-based taxes, which we might hear about tonight, or increasing taxes on oil production, it's going to be felt by Alaskans, whether it's in reduced paychecks, fewer job opportunities, or increased cost of living. And as we know, it's already expensive to live here. But by carefully reducing spending now, we can prepare our state and its residents to flourish in what will likely be lean future years. So that's what we're dealing with. While I'm not here to say that revenue options shouldn't be thoughtfully considered, a plan to balance the budget with only revenue increases and no spending reductions will only stifle our private economy and negatively impact the job prospects for Alaskans who already face the highest unemployment rate in the country. Substantial cuts are going to be necessary to rebalance our fiscal situation and foster prosperity. Just as the rest of us as Alaskans have to manage our household budgets, the state of Alaska needs to manage our spending responsibly to create a stable economic future for individuals and businesses. And if we're responsible now, we can look forward to a bright future and a strong economy. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Melodie. And now I'd like to welcome the Right Honorable Les Gara to present on behalf of the opposition.
Thank you, Drew. I'm supporting our local business, and I also just wrote on my pants, and so they might be related. I don't know. The question really that we're facing right now is a serious one. It's, do we want an Alaska that people want to live in, or do we want an Alaska that people are going to leave? That's the crossroads we're at. Obviously, things are expensive in Alaska. You heard that we spend a lot of money here. And at statehood, that was debated. Would Alaska, with its vast land and few roads and lack of economies of scale, be able to fund their own government? Right? And that's why Alaskans were granted their right to subsurface rights, so we could help fund our government, because things are more expensive up here. It's more expensive to ship materials out to Bethel to build a school than it is in Kansas to drive those right down the road to the neighboring town. That's just a reality. Let's go to something that our think tank at the university, ICER, came up with in a study, which is that every $100 million in budget cuts isn't fun. Every $100 million in budget cuts costs us about 1,000 jobs. Jobs that aren't created are jobs that people lose in the private and public sector combined. How does that happen? Less money in the economy, less money for people to go to restaurants with, less money for people to hire a contractor with. It ripples through the economy. Well, we haven't just cut $100 million from the budget. And when we have this debate, I'm surprised to always hear, like, people don't think that we've ever started cutting the budget. So let's talk about reality. Since fiscal year 2015, the state has cut agency spending by $650 million. That has hurt seniors. It's hurt kids. We're one of 10 states in this country that don't have statewide pre-K, yet we complain that our kids don't read very well at fourth grade. Shocking, right? $650 million in cuts just to agencies. Education has been basically flat funded from since FY15, but measured against inflation, which is a real thing that schools have to pay for, we're $90 million down. Well, we're just talking dollars, but let's talk people. That means class sizes have gone up in every single major school district in the state. Anchorage, Fairbanks, Juneau, Ketchikan, Kenai, Kodiak. Class sizes have gone up. We've lost 1,000 teachers and staff because of that $90 million loss. Okay, these things are real. We're providing less opportunity to the next generation by not taking action. Okay, we've cut the budget, $650 so far in operating, and we've cut about $400 million from the average capital budget for construction projects, for maintaining the Anchorage port that's falling apart right now. That used to be an average of about $500 million of state funding. It's now down to about $100 million of state funding. In total, in all state spending, we've cut about $3 billion from the budget since FY15. Just agency and capital budgets, about $1.1 billion. So it's not like nobody's cut the budget. And it's not like there haven't been effects. Just at the university, that's been cut by about $75 million, but the plan is to go down to a $120 million cut within the next two years. We've lost 500 faculty. We've lost 4,000 students in the last 4 years. When you go to the University of Alaska and you graduate, you are more likely to stay in Alaska and keep your job skills here for our economy. When you go outside to the university, you're more likely to never come back. We're shipping our job talent out of state right now because of those cuts to the university. So let's not say that we haven't been cutting the budget. We've been cutting it harmfully. If this is a state that you want to live in, if that's your goal. We've fallen so far behind on construction spending that we're $2 billion behind on deferred maintenance at the university and in state buildings and infrastructure. Those buildings are going to start leaking. They're going to become much more expensive to maintain by ignoring them, right? So it's not really a pretty picture. And it's not a picture that you hear when people say, hey, you should start cutting the budget. Where have you been the last 5 years? The budget has been slashed. Ask a senior citizen living at the Pioneer Home. Ask a senior citizen who is told they're going to lose their senior benefits. Those are the kind of things we're cutting right now. We're cutting at bone now. We're not recreationally cutting anymore. Adjusted per capita for inflation, we're at about the lowest budget we've been at for the last 40 years, okay? And 40 years ago, we had fewer communities where we had to maintain water and sewer. 40 years ago, we didn't have renewable energy that we would want in our communities, right? There are more things today that make sense today that actually cost money, but we're at about the lowest level we've been at in 40 years. So when you say cut the budget, now it's time really to say who you want to hurt. Is it the next generation? Do you want parents who are already talking about leaving with their job skills to leave and taking their engineering degrees out of the state? So we can't take this crisis out on our seniors. And it's really, I'll just leave you with a quote from Wally Hickel that gets mangled over and over and over by people. I'll just shorten it instead of mangling it. And what Governor Hickel, a pretty conservative guy, said was there's no vision, no hope, no future, no agenda for Alaska if your only cause is to cut the budget. Thank you.
Now we're going to give them each a microphone and let them sit next to each other and ask some questions if we get some question cards handed up. But while I'm waiting to see if the audience has any questions, I'll go ahead and fire off one. Melodie, since you went first, you know what? I'll go ahead and make Les go first for this one. So, Representative Guerra, I think that without really casting any doubt or relating to a lot of the points that you were making, many people in the audience have likely dealt with a portion of state government that seem to be behaving rather sillily. They've dealt with requirements that seem like, why is this requirement here, and why are you paying someone to impose this requirement on me? So my question for you is that, aside from the question of sort of whether or not we should have major cuts, if we just go ahead and accept that we've cut enough, and yet we still see these things where we seem to be spending money in silly ways, where does the pressure to become more efficient come from, if not from sort of an abstracted look at the total and start looking for the best place to take it to make reductions?
Your job, I think, as a policymaker is not just to make a cut. You know, the legislature used to say, let's just do 10% here. Well, what's the impact on human beings? You have to study that first. Your job is to figure out what the impact is of what you're going to do and not to do it if you're going to hurt people, right? So yeah, find waste, find efficiencies. I will guarantee you at this point, there are efficiencies you can find, just like at your insurance company that takes forever to get back at you on a claim, right? I mean, at big institutions, there are inefficiencies. There's no doubt. But those inefficiencies pale in comparison to what's underfunded in the state at this point. One of 10 states that doesn't have statewide pre-K, but we complain that our kids aren't reading well. I mean, that's insane. So, yeah, I mean, we're falling behind on schools. There are inefficiencies. Those inefficiencies are not going to make up for what we need to do to build a future in this state. You know, it would be a different discussion if we hadn't started cutting the budget at this point. But we've been cutting it for 5 years, and at this point, people are getting hurt. Go over to the Pioneer Home on 11th Avenue and ask somebody.
All right, thanks a bunch. I guess, Melodie, do you want to take a crack at that? No, you don't have to. It wasn't really directed at you, but I feel like I ought to give you an opportunity if you were just itching to say something.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that last year, many of us were sort of paying attention and saw the governor propose a significant number of pretty substantial budget reductions above and beyond what we've seen this year. I think that Donna Arduin became a somewhat household name around the state. Do you think that he did it wrong? Do you think that people just weren't there for it, even though they should have been? Do a little bit of a postmortem on the governor's budget last year and what he came up with this year, and sort of how does that sort of compare and contrast with your statement that we have a lot of cuts left to make?
Well, after last year's budget, I was personally pretty surprised that the governor proposed a pretty stable budget this year, knowing the difference in revenue that we were going to see anyway, and even lower revenue than we saw last year. It was a brave budget last year, certainly. Nobody wants to be the person to come out and say, I'm sorry, we don't have any money. But that's the situation that we're in, and I think at this point now it is up to our legislature to figure out what we're going to do, because the governor has not proposed something that is viable. Not this year. I mean, we can get away with it this year, but this is really the last year we can get away with it. We are out of money.
And this one's on a bit of a different topic, but by way of teaser, I'll ask you both as a last question. Someone has written, the budget deficit is caused by the PFD. Why not reduce the PFD? It's up to you.
I took the last one. You can go first.
Look, I'm glad that question was asked. You know, there was a time if we acted quick, you could either raise all taxes in a fair way, or raise a fair income tax, or raise a fair sales tax, or come up with a modest cut to the PFD, and you would have solved the budget deficit. But we've waited so long that no one of those solutions even works now. You have to have at least two of those solutions. That's how long we've waited. You know, I would say, you hear the story, you hear the line, you know, if you don't have enough money, you got to tighten your belt. That's what we do at my house. Well, if you can't feed your kids or send your kids to college, you might get a second job too. It's time to raise revenue. Thanks.
Well, I actually agree. You know, we have such a huge budget gap that this will be very difficult to close if we do it with just massive spending reductions or just huge tax increases. It's not going to be easy either way, but I would not recommend getting rid of the PFD. The PFD is a form of income, and like any other dividend that you might get from a stock, and every single time that we reduce the PFD below the statutory level, it is an income tax on Alaskans, and unfortunately, it is a very regressive income tax. It takes a larger portion of the income from our families in poverty than it does from our wealthy families, so taking it away is a very, very poorly structured income tax.
Right on.
I agree with a bit of that.
Hey, we're making progress already. Look at that.